Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to talk about some rather obscure lore which actually might be returning, so I figured why not have a little bit of a deep dive. This will be smaller than the deep dives themselves as, there's not that much. There's actually very little. But today's topic, as you can see from the title, are the Centaurs. You see, mostly when people think about Centaurs, they think about the Centaurs, a sub-race to the Beastmen who are known to be very fast, very vicious like their fellow kin, love partying with a lot of alcohol, and, well, they like to breed. This is why their sire is known as Gorus, sire of 1,000 young. But it may be interesting enough to know that Centaurs are not actually centaurs. If you look at their feet, they don't actually have hooves. Yes, it's pretty much going into just very specifics there, but that was a bit of a classification for them. But that doesn't mean that centaurs don't exist. In fact, we know of one very large and terrifying one known as the bull centaurs. These are chaos dwarfs fused with their bulls, and they're absolutely gigantic. Well, at least on the 8th edition standard. They were much smaller when it was the earlier army book. But you will notice hooves, and these are true centaur by the classification of the word. But no, this video is not dedicated to the bull centaur, as that would be kind of boring. Instead, we're going to talk about a rather long forgotten race. Instead, we'll be talking about these, the actual centaur, a race that actually dominated around the northern parts of the Warhammer fantasy world for a long time. There's not a lot of art, there's not a lot of lore, mostly because they were introduced very early into the lifespan of Warhammer Fantasy. The art that you're actually seeing is from 1992, 30 years ago. Good lord, this is making me feel very old, as I am 30 myself, but this is a race which a lot of people have been very curious about, as just as quickly as they were introduced, they were kind of removed. Now, a lot of people do think, yes, they were removed because of the introduction of the Centaur to add a more bestial type creature. However, there's reasons to believe that they were just simply wiped out, but might be making a return in Warhammer The Old World. The little bit of main lore that we do have of them is as follows. Centaurs are enigmatic creatures, the wild horsemen of the stepplands. They are a free and uninhibited race, intelligent and reasonable, but not very interested in sedentary life. They live by herding and hunting. They are talented orators and have a great love of language and music. Their own tongue is melodic and complex. For their physique, centaurs have the body of large horses with the upper torso of a human. They are large monsters and count as over 10 feet tall. Because of their shape, they are not actually that far off the ground. In terms of world distribution, this is where we can see where they're actually from. They mostly are seen in the eastern parts of the stepplands, but can also be found around the areas of the New World. We'll talk about map distribution properly soon. And finally, they travel between the two hunting migratory herds of bison and deer, so they will actively hunt for those, with their alignment being neutral. This would kind of actually make sense considering that they just want to live their own life. They could be seen as rather peaceful, and they don't really want to involve themselves in anything that doesn't really involve them. The idea of neutral races really isn't out of the question, considering that we already have a bunch of neutral races in established lore that has really stood the test of time, you know. The Ogre Kingdoms, the Tomb Kings, all those are considered neutral. The Dogs of War, or any countries associated with them, would also be considered neutral, as they can sometimes be hired out by darker evil forces. Now, in terms of map distribution, this is the interesting part, as we'll obviously have to reference older lore here too. There was a lot of movement. As you can see here, they would have moved from the lands known as Nagaroth all the way to the eastern steppes, meaning that they could easily be in like Warhammer Korea too. They said that they were in the eastern parts of it, which could have led to what was their demise in lore originally. You see, obviously in the lands of Nagaroth there would be Dark Elves. The Dark Elves had fled from Ulthuan and would have fought anything there. We know that they fought against the Tong and so on, so it's very possible that any centaurs around that area would have been wiped out. I'm assuming that the Centaurs had a rather large empire prior to the coming of Chaos, so everything which counts as the Chaos Wastelands to the north would have probably been hospitable at some point, albeit still very cold. And then in the eastern steppes, well, you have a lot more to worry about. You'd have the ogres around that area, some chaos dwarves looking to slave people, the hobgoblin Khanate, and, well, pretty much anything else, not counting even chaos warriors too. So it's not surprising that this race eventually became extinct, or at least as far as we know, because they were written out of canon. But some of them could have actually survived. You see, back in the day, chaos centaurs were a thing too, like I said, before the coming of the Centaurs, and what you can see from this lore is that it's very similar to what eventually became a Centaur. Centaurs live on the northern and eastern edges of the forests of the Old World, where the trees give way to the sparse grasslands of the northern wastes. They are wandering creatures that rely upon hunting and raiding to provide their few needs. Centaurs have heavy, brutish bodies with strong, clumsy limbs. They are unable to make any but the simplest things and rely upon chaos beastmen and other creatures to provide weapons for them. Although they can speak, their voices are thick, slow, and inarticulate. Centaurs are ill-tempered, violent, and resentful of other races who are more skillful and dexterous than themselves. Before a battle, they drink buckets full of strong beer, becoming excited and violent so that their tempers can only be quelled by deeds of the most bloodthirsty kind. That's pretty much it when it comes to them, and yeah, it actually follows that of the Centaur. This is very, very early, before Centaurs became Centaurs. But miniatures did actually exist through Citadel, and not only that, but we know that they're corruptible. This is a main thing here. Any centaurs that would have been corrupted prior to the supposed fall of their race, we don't know if their race still exists or not, then they would have still been found among the ranks of the Chaos Warriors or any other warbands, as, yeah, we see this happen a lot in lore, where sometimes there could be something that was long lost, like the Famia, for example, and they just show up to do some damage. So already we got something quite interesting here, as, yeah, this is a really, really cool race. A fast-moving skirmish cav type of army. Well, they are the cav themselves, and they were lost through time, which is actually kind of disappointing, but this is something that happened very early on. Back in those days, from what I've been seeing through my research, as I wasn't there, considering that I'm only 30, Games Workshop was introducing loads and loads of different races, factions, and so on. It's something that we know as the door ajar, where yeah, maybe they'll get used, maybe they won't, maybe they'll just get written out completely and then brought back magically at some point because the plot calls for it. And very interestingly enough now, it looks like the plot is calling for it, for Warhammer The Old World, the new tabletop game which is going to bring us back to the Warhammer fantasy world. You see, not too long ago, actually in 2021, when Games Workshop posted Kislev Ascendant and Square Bases, this is an article on Warhammer community which was very big, not only for the fact that it gave us some information regarding Kislev as a confirmed race, but also the fact that we could use our old miniatures and so on for Warhammer The Old World. But they also posted some lore regarding Kislev, which is quite interesting, which goes as follows. Students of Warhammer lore will also note that the borders of Kislev are very different from what they may be familiar with. The eastern border is not here defined by the World's Edge Mountains, but in fact extends through the Belyevortav Pass, god that word is strange, through the Great Skulllands, northernmost reaches of the Darklands, through the Mountains of Morn, and out into the limitless expanse of the eastern steppes beyond. Clearly at this time, Kislev was a vast empire indeed, its territories encompassing lands said by some to be haunted by hobgoblins, centaurs, and half-orcs, though who can say which of these, if any, are true. So, first up, one thing that you have to notice is obviously Kislev is a very large empire. It's only small now because, well, during this timeline, which is something that we're going to experience, this has been confirmed by Games Workshop, is the coming of Asavarkul, which basically destroys Kislev to what we know of today, the Kislev that we know of in Warhammer Fantasy lore, and the Kislev that we know in Total War Warhammer 3. The nation is very small because most of the people were slaughtered, and I mean absolutely slaughtered. But there's a mention of the Centaurs, which has been the first time since, well, 1994, I think that was the last mention of Centaurs themselves, which could mean that we might see the return of the Centaur in one way, shape or form in Warhammer The Old World. I don't imagine that it's going to be a fully fledged army because, well, let's be fair, there's a lot of armies coming in from all the old 8th edition stuff, and we're already getting, you know, 2 new ones. This is Cathay and Kislev, and there's already theories that we might get a few more. So, what would the Centaurs be? Well, I imagine that the Centaurs might be hireable as a neutral unit, something in the line of Dogs of War, as it kind of makes sense, a race that might just be fleeing from Asavar Call and trying to find some work elsewhere. Hobgoblins are getting mentions there. Hell, the Hobgoblin Carnet actually gets mentioned, hinted a few times with a little icon. Half-orcs are its own kettle of fish, which we'll talk about because I do have a greenskin style video coming out very, very soon. But the fact that Games Workshop themselves mention Centaurs, well, that could mean one of two things. Either they're actually coming back in one way, shape, or form, or it's just another door ajar situation where they're just leaving it out there for the possibility in the future. My only real big question, which I hope gets answered in the future, is how are they still alive? By this point in the timeline, the Northern Chaos Wastes have already felt the coming of chaos and everything is, you know, very dangerous, with only Chaos factions generally traveling through there, and even the Chaos factions having trouble because, you know, demons, demonkin, pretty much anything that is violent will try to attack you. Then obviously in the far western portions of the map, we do have the Dark Elves, which would have come into contact and attacked pretty much anything around that area, especially if it caused them problems. So any surviving Centaurs would have probably just been enslaved. And if they are coming back, how do the ones in the Far East survive? Do they just stay in Warhammer Korea? Is that a place which is safe for them? As we do know, very violent tribes, you know, the Tong, the Kurgans, all the different stuff that does live around that area, even the Hobgoblins, they would naturally be hunting down the Centaur, unless the Centaur are very, very strong, and it's just something that we haven't seen just yet. But it does make me question how the Centaur can survive all the way to that point of the timeline, right before Asavar Call, and maybe they just get wiped out at that point. This is why we haven't seen any Centaur after, as Asavar Call might have just eradicated them all, or near enough all of them. Naturally, we know that a grand majority of what little lore we do have, which actually says a lot, was moved on to other races. The Centaurs were moved to being Centaurs in the Chaos form, and the nomadic people, tribes and stuff was moved to the Kurgans, which still fell under Chaos. But we did lose the melodic, harmonious type of distinction that the race had. So who knows what the future may bring, but I'm kind of curious. I would love to see more about the Centaurs. It's very weird that they bring back something so old, but then again, we know that all the staff are returning and they could have some fun ideas. With all that being said, what do you guys think about the Centaur? Would you like to see them return to the Warhammer setting? In what capacity would you like to see them return? That's the big question, I'd say, as I think they'd work well as just being hired out as a supplement rather than their own race or faction. However, if they do have a lot of territory, yeah,